Well, I think it is time to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone who is joining us today. My name is Lindsay Van Weergen, and I am the Senior Director of Marketing here at the International Institute for Analytics. Welcome to today's webinar, Breaking Analytic Barriers, How to Democratize Data Science in Your Organization. We are so excited to talk about this topic. In case you're new to IIA, we are a research and advisory firm. We were co-founded by Tom Davenport and our CEO, Jack Phillips, almost 10 years ago. We work with companies to grow their analytic capabilities, improve performance, and get the most impact from their data teams. This webinar is part of our ongoing webinar series that highlight important concepts, techniques, and strategies in the world of data and business analytics. Our clients rely on IIA to provide unbiased insights and a range of perspectives from our network of independent analytic experts and practitioners. Today's webinar is a little bit unique. We are partnering with Alteryx, which is fantastic. What makes the Alteryx platform different is they are the leader in the self-service data analytics movement with a platform that can discover, prep, and analyze all your data, then deploy and share analytics at scale for deeper insights, faster than you ever thought possible. You unite your entire team with data and analytic assets that are easily accessible. Alteryx makes your data more searchable and trackable by giving you powerful data lineage and cataloging that provides increased visibility for governance. Alteryx, we're glad to have you with us today. So for more information about IIA, visit iianalytics.com, and for Alteryx, go to alteryx.com. Before we dive in and I hand it over to our host, Liam, there's a couple housekeeping things that I want to go over. One, we're going to be submitting questions in the chat window, so you all should see a pop-up from me already that says welcome and where to put your questions. Liam will be taking questions throughout the presentation, so please submit them here. And we will be doing a recording of the webinar coming out tomorrow, along with some additional resources that will be mentioned during this webinar. So please keep an eye out for that. Okay, Liam, I think it is time for me to hand it over to you.
Oh, thanks very much, Lindsay. Good day again, everyone, and welcome to our discussion. Again, it's Breaking Analytics Barriers, How to Democratize Data Science in Your Organization. As Lindsay mentioned, I'm your host, Liam Yu, Director of Product Marketing here at Alteryx. And with me today is Bill Franks and Nick Jewell. Bill is Chief Analytics Officer for the International Institute of Analytics. He's also the co-author of Taming the Big Data Tidal Wave and the Analytics Revolution. His work spans clients in a variety of different industries, ranging from Fortune 500 companies to small nonprofit organizations. Nick Jewell is Director of Product Evangelism and Enablement at Alteryx. His role covers many different things, including product management, sales, and customer service teams to build Alteryx end-to-end platform and the vision for our customers. He also acts as our product evangelist and works with analysts, data science communities, and the wider general public. Welcome, gentlemen. So we're going to get started. Yes, welcome. So today, throughout history, the idea of democratizing technology has signaled the advent of every human endeavor and enterprise. If you think about the Gutenberg press to personal computers, this is something that has really kind of advented any major change in our industries. The Greeks envisioned this value as the idea that Prometheus did with stealing fire from the gods and gifting it to man. Of course, today we're going to talk about a different type of delivery, modern data science to the general population and in the information age. And how do you democratize the use of it so that you can put the power of analytics into the center of business decision making? So I'd like to start the topic up with, what does it mean to democratize data science? Bill?
Yeah, I think I'll cover off on a few points I think are critical to the entire concept. The first one being obviously that the main point is that you want to expand the base of people who can both create and consume analytics and data science processes. So, historically, we've pushed to have a wider range of consumers potentially. I think the democratizing of data science is attempting to drive more on the side of creators. And then as you think about that, in order to do that, you're obviously going to have to push yourself in a couple of different dimensions, which include challenging traditional rules on things like tool usage, who uses what tools and under what conditions, what kind of data do people have access to, and what are the job roles that people have, because you're starting to intermix some of these activities that used to be in certain spots by certain roles into other places. To do all of that, though, you've got to provide safety measures to prevent both mistakes and abuse. So I think abuse is realistically relatively rare, but mistakes are definitely a very real possibility. When you start to give people more power, there's going to be, just like when a kid learns to drive a car, they're a lot more likely to have an accident. And so you've got to pre-plan for that and put in place some mechanisms to help mitigate those risks. In order to do that, then you obviously want to implement skills development programs. You want to have programs in place that will help the targeted audience that's going to get more capability, to help make sure that they have what they need, both in terms of how can you use the tools that they're getting access to from both a mechanical perspective as well as a theoretical perspective in terms of the algorithms and such within them. How do they access the data, and what is the contents of that data, the appropriate use, et cetera. You want to have all of that. But then I think the most important part about democratizing analytics is it's about increasing the value that's being driven by analytics and data science initiatives across the organization, because more people will be able to contribute to the overall pool of things that are getting done.
That's great. You know, talking a little further about that goal, I mean, what are we trying to really accomplish across an organization here? And this is kind of for both you and for Nick, that question.
Yeah, sure, Liam, I'll take that one. Yeah, so for me, the goal of democratizing data and, of course, data science is really about taking that complete analytical journey where we move from raw data to insights to actually taking action, and then opening it up so that there really are no barriers, no friction to getting access and working with that data to solving some of your business problems.
Good. Yeah. Is this, I mean, is this a fundamental change today? I mean, why does this matter now?
Well, democratizing data, I think, really means three things. First of all, it's about making data available and easy to find. So if data is only available to certain groups within your business, then you're going to have a situation where these groups are going to end up making different decisions based on what they know and what they have access to. So democratization, first of all, is really about empowering everyone to be able to discover the range of data that's not only available, but also that can be used for decision making. I think in the public space, this first challenge gets largely solved by the big search providers, to the extent that most search users don't even need to click through on the links that they provide. The answer is served right there. In companies, this kind of capability starts to lag behind. So there's rarely a central search capability that brings together all these assets, the data, the dashboards, the collective knowledge into that searchable form. Secondly, I think the data that we do democratize needs to be easy to work with, both to consume but also to develop further. So democratization here for me means transparency. So I need to understand the sources and how the data arrived in this current form, and ultimately this leads to a sense of trust. Finally, democratizing data, I think, means that we have a collective responsibility for protecting these valuable data assets in the future. So we've got to invest in their upkeep, their quality, but also their ownership, and of course their usage. Bill, what about you?
Yeah, and I'd say I think part of it, it's an evolution on a couple of fronts. So if you go back not too many years, the skills required to do any type of reasonable analytics or data science were very high. You were using very technical tools involving a lot of coding. Data was hard to access. So I think concurrent with the evolution of tools and data platforms to make it much more accessible, the demand for analytics on the other side has increased. And so I think what's happened is, as anyone on the call who does analytics and data science for a living would probably attest to, there's no one I know out there who's sitting around twiddling their thumbs without enough to do. And so this is almost a necessary step. Now that it's possible, it's about the only way that you can have a chance to meet all of this demand that's suddenly coming at us, which is a result of, the success that we've had in our past efforts.
I see. So this is kind of a collective realization for businesses. They generate the value of that trust by actually providing that transparency and providing a process for delivering accurate decision making. Interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about the stakeholders then that are involved. We talk about all kinds of folks that you would get involved with data in different ways. How do you see this sort of playing out in an organization?
Yeah, so I think one of the things to think about here is there's different constituencies within an organization who might be affected in different ways. So if we just go through them kind of one by one, on the lower end of the skills and capability spectrum are a more typical business user. And I think in reality, even as we talk about democratizing data science, what we're mostly talking about here is a continuation of maybe access to some processes they can run on demand as is, very little editing. So you can almost think of this as, instead of just basic SQL-based reports that a business person might have had 10 years ago, maybe they can now kick off a pretty sophisticated, update to a churn model or a predictive maintenance model, but it's going to run as is. A power user, these would be the people who typically might have done a lot of Excel work and doing a little bit more, a little more sophisticated stuff. They might, in today's world, the democratizing of data science and analytics might mean they can do a little bit of modification of some of the reports or processes, maybe add a few new metrics, but they're not going to be able to go too crazy. I think the sweet spot is the citizen data scientist constituency. These are the people who are really the superpower users. They probably aren't necessarily formally trained in analytics and data science, and even if they had some formal training, they're in a role where that's not their official job. But now it's possible to give them access to some really powerful methodologies and tool sets. Of course, as we'll talk again about in a little bit, there's some limits. Data scientists get evolve their role here because they start to have an oversight and coaching role for these other constituencies. And rather than being a burden, that can be a fun and exciting thing to do, but it also frees up time for them to actually focus on the more complex problems that they want to focus on. I hear data scientist types complain all the time about having to spend so much time on basic query and reporting results. Well, here's a way to offload that so you can focus on the good things. And then business executives, they're probably not gonna, for the most part, get into doing things their own, but they'll have an entire organization of people that are now better enabled to answer their questions. So they're going to start to ask more analytical questions and so forth. And I think what this points out is that when people think about democratizing data science or general self-service initiatives, they think of it as, quote, an initiative. And I encourage people to think of this as many initiatives, a number of initiatives, because you just hear these 5 constituencies, each would need different training, different access, different governance, different ongoing processes to make it all work. And that's an important consideration. You've got to think through how to enable it on each of those levels. It's not a single-threaded, simplistic approach.
So just expanding a little on that, do you guys see this then as a real change in business process and behavior?
Well, I think it affects pretty much all of these categories in different ways. Democratization really does mean something different for each of these different groups, as Bill's mentioned. I mean, just taking that first one for now, at Alteryx, we kind of see 2 different groups in this space. So you might see a business user as an information worker, somebody who, touches business applications and systems on a daily basis. Democratization for them means the ability for these users to have access to processes that deliver the insights for them in order to complete their tasks. This could range in complexity from a simple report delivery, a forecast, even a next best action to a customer. For the other type, the business leader, the decision maker, they only need access to not only the data, but sophisticated and automated processes that allow them to explore different scenarios. So they've understood where the data comes from, the data being sliced up in multiple angles, then they're armed to make the best information, to make a decision based on all that process. So the kind of scenarios we see with Alteryx to deliver these kind of analytic process automation scenarios. I'll give you an example. Alpha Tame Group, which is an automotive firm in the Middle East, they do 300,000 transactions every single month that now require value-added taxing. And previously, this was delivered by those information workers in a finance department using Excel, but it was a really lengthy and cumbersome process. So automating, democratizing this process using Alteryx delivered results back to those finance teams and saves them around 3 months of work per year. But it also gives compliance, controller teams a much more unique insight to make decisions against transactions that get flagged as non-compliant. So broadly across the spectrum, we can see benefits from democratization in each of these categories.
Interesting. So it really is about doing traditional things in completely new ways.
Absolutely. I really want to drill into Bill's comments around the citizen data science a little more, because I think this is where it gets the most interesting. I think democratization not only talks about access to data and existing assets, it really is about opening up whole new classes of capabilities, but still providing analytic guardrails as users take those first steps. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, in fact, let's dig into that citizen data scientist role, because I think that's the one people are most intrigued by, and that is new. So what does this mean? I mean, first of all, they're going to be primarily located in the business, not in the core analytics and data science team. At least that's what I've seen. People who seem to come into this role, and almost by definition, if they were in the analytics and data science team, they'd already be a professional analytics person with the full-time job focus that way. However, and this is really critical, these people require training and ongoing coaching and oversight. So you have to be very, very cautious here. I liken it to, I think earlier, having a child learn to drive. I've got a son who I've taken out for his first 2 driving lessons, right? It's amazing the mistakes that they can make or things they don't know because they haven't done it before. And so while you are enabling these new capabilities, just like as a parent, you've got to oversee that. And then you've also got to make sure that everybody's ready for it. You're certainly going to have some people you attempted to tee up that didn't get it done. Now, the other interesting thing is, even as you train these people to do it, they're going to learn better how to focus on the types of questions to ask. And this is really critical in my mind, because it's not just about answering more questions on their own, but if you start to get better at both asking questions and kind of helping put together a process to answer some of those questions, you'll become better able to identify questions generically, because you'll understand the data better. You understand what's possible a little bit better. And that's an important point. But these people, most of all, the citizen data scientists, have to have self-awareness of their own limits and when they have to ask for help. They have to understand that they're being given a freedom that is on the upper edge of what many people will be comfortable with, even with the guardrails and guidance, governance that we have in place. So they absolutely need to then have that self-awareness and ask for help and pull themselves back where they need it, which leads to the need to have that support system available. We can't just talk about it. If I'm going to be the citizen data scientist saying, I need to raise my hand, I need someone to help me out on this, someone has to be there to help, or else the whole thing falls apart, and then we risk that person will just go do whatever they feel they need to do.
I see. So this is quite an interesting role then. How do you see this then kind of working for championing business data-driven decisions? I mean, is there a way for them to promote this, the democratization of as a foundation of the way that they work?
Well, Liam, what we see at Alteryx, I think the beauty of the citizen data science role is that it can and should, to Bill's point, exist throughout the business. So not just in a core data science or a center of excellence team that we'll probably discuss later on. This is absolutely critical because we're looking for complete integration within a business department or a function. And that citizen data scientist plays such a crucial role in really owning business-facing models or analysis. And with their levels of business domain understanding, they get to communicate and develop their work in a way that the business users understand, using business terminology rather than data science jargon. But they do have an absolutely critical role to play in building a culture of openness around communicating not only the work that they do, so that's the models, the forecasts, the recommendations, but also explaining the underlying concepts, how data flows into the model, pushing for reusability and transparency at each step in that process. I'll quickly mention governance as well. Lots of people assume that this word kind of only has negative connotations, but it's really a two-way street. You govern your citizen data scientists to make sure that they're using the right data and they're coming to the right conclusions. But also governance is about making sure you've got the groundwork in place to actually provide them with the sources of data and that support network that Bill mentions, continuing education, peer review to confirm their findings and make them permanent.
That's great, Nick. That's great. Actually, that's perfect because I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about sort of, what are the, risks involved with, democratizing data science.
Yeah, I'll start with a few thoughts here. And there are definitely risks, right? As we've talked about, giving someone too much freedom, freedom beyond where they may be able to handle can definitely cause damage. Often accidental as well. And you can go back, this has been an issue for many years. When the SQL-based reporting tools first came out and people started to give some folks access to queries, I can't tell you how many times I saw someone drag and drop to create a supposed report. Under the hood, it was generating SQL, but of course the user didn't have any way to understand that SQL and realize that it was doing exactly the wrong thing, even though they got back columns labeled with data that looked okay. This obviously elevates that because now you may be adding in additional complicated operations on top. So you've got to be careful about that. Another risk is going to be pushback from both IT and data science teams who don't want to give up control, right? IT teams are traditionally pretty nervous about letting even data scientists who are really skilled at this have access to some of the data and do some of these things. So of course they'll be even more nervous about people where we know we're kind of letting them push their limits. At the same time, data science teams have had control of all of this. And I think it comes back to the whole thing is that there will be a few mistakes that can happen. And they will happen, and you have to prepare for that. You absolutely will have some mistakes happen, but I would argue you have mistakes happen today just the same. So you need to focus then back on all the good that's happening and how you're enabling more to go on. But you don't want to let the concern over this drive away from the value. Now, one really big problem you can run into is that you end up having so much rapid proliferation of processes because so many more people are trying to build them that it's not just that you end up with redundant things because I might build something and Nick and Liam both build a very similar thing and we just didn't know it. But these can be largely untested. So you got to have something to help address that. And that gets back to you've got to pay sufficient attention to the governance and the scalability and the consistency of approach. And when we talk scalability here, it's not just technical scalability in terms of systems, it's scalability from an organizational capacity perspective. So if we've struggled to implement the processes that we've been creating historically with the people we had doing it, and we go out and add a whole bunch more people creating processes that need to be tested and deployed and maintained, there's an organizational side of that scalability that has to be addressed right alongside the more traditional technology scalability factors.
And Bill, I just want to take up your point there about too much freedom right at the beginning. I like to look at this as two sides of a coin, really. Does too much freedom actually mean too little governance and vice versa? So for me, a lack of governance around the data itself kind of means that we're wasting resources building models and basing decisions on data that's probably not fit for purpose. So there's a time cost involved, but there's also a larger business risk that you're going to make bad situational or even automated decisions as a result of that model. Then I think there's a risk of too much freedom around adopting advanced analytic capabilities without the right checks and balances. And again, this could mean wasted cycles, training the wrong kinds of model, but it opens up really a Pandora's box. Liam, I'm going to go back to the classical example for you there. Pandora's box of possible disasters when you come to use these models for real business decisions. I mean, if there's freedom without the discipline of data science model review, you can end up with a model that gives not only terrible performance, but also contains potentially built-in bias. And that could actually end up being illegal if we're biasing against certain demographic groups within our base. We also see this with companies that are just starting their journey to unleash advanced analytics. So typically, there's a whole slew of analytic point solutions being used, sometimes under the covers, sometimes publicly. And there's often very little coordination about how all of these solutions actually fit together into the bigger picture. So sometimes the solutions can be new and shiny and they're powered by AI, which I've obviously got my quote fingers and that's lovely. But more often than not, there are a dozen different open source solutions that nobody really owns or maintains. So the big risk of too much freedom here is that it can cause significant technical debt. And this needs to be controlled and obviously paid back to deliver real long-term value. Now, all of these points, all of this can be avoided by developing a citizen data science strategy that places light touch governance on things like data access, discoverability, and then brings together flexibility from open source with enterprise strength, version control, reusability, and then of course, seamless deployment.
That's great, Nick. I mean, I really want to go into these sort of how do you mitigate these risks a bit further? You know, how do you make sure that these concerns, you know, as we're doing our due diligence and due care, get addressed?
Yeah.
Bill,
So yeah, I'll give a few thoughts on this one to start out here. You know, when you talk about mitigating that risk, I think the first is you've got to formalize things like the mentoring programs where data scientists are going to support the citizen data scientists. It gets back to too much governance is bad, too little governance is obviously bad. And we're talking about getting someone to maximize their potential, not move beyond the proper point. So having experts look over their shoulder, it's much like an apprenticeship program of sorts. You're looking over their shoulder, you're making sure they're doing the right thing. Of course, if you find an apprentice can't handle it, they might get taken out of the program. You also have to position the mentoring to your data science team as an investment in that improved organizational scale, not as a chore. The reality is if people think it through, yeah, you're going to have to spend your time helping out some other people who you're going to consider not all that skilled. But if you don't do that, what you're left with is all the questions they're trying to answer coming to your desk, and then you'll be complaining about the even longer time you're going to spend having to just do some basic block and tackle work rather than the real work that you want to. So this really helps the organization and can help free up those mentors to do a better work, which is really the next point. Let those data scientists say, look, you get those exciting higher impact problems that you always talk about. You get these other folks helping on some of the basics, and you can move on to those. Because again, this isn't that a citizen data scientist is going to go out and be able to build a cutting edge, brand new, super sophisticated process. This is about saying, you know, if we've already got a pretty stabilized customer data set, we've already built a whole bunch of churn models, you know what, we've got a general structure set up. We can let this citizen data scientist go in and experiment with, well, what if I wanted to build the model but predict it for 60 days out instead of 30 days out? Right. That's what I would call more of a tweak to an existing stable process than an overhaul. That's something that we should, if we set it up properly, enable people to do. Now, part of that, though, whatever they do build, they have to have a formal review process. So if you're not a professional, then there should be, before your work gets deployed to anyone but yourself, a review process where someone who is an expert looks at it and blesses it and goes, yep, yeah, I think you got that right. So, hey, Bill, you wanted to try a 60-day versus 30-day churn model. I see how you defined your 60-day target and you used our standard variables. If this all looks good, I think you're okay to go ahead and have your team experiment with some offers based on that model. But then on top of the governance we've talked about, there's also governance around, once you've deployed these processes, how are you going to track all of them? Because there will be a lot more. How do you enable updates? So what if something has to be changed? You want to set up a process to that. And then also the expiration, which again has always been an issue But when you had a handful of models, you could almost just kind of manually identify, oh, this one's old, we need to update it or drop it. If you start to get hundreds or thousands of these processes out there, you've got to have some automated routines where, you know, something's going to get expired unless someone takes a proactive action to turn it on. And these are all things you have to think about up front.
Yeah, from my side, Bill, I think, you know, the biggest way that we can mitigate most of these risks, the big one is enablement. So you want to make your citizen data science program a success. And I've kind of got two strategies for you here. So firstly, you can run a formal or a top-down approach. Maybe you hold workshops or training classes on all of those key topics across the analytics spectrum. So everything from tips and tricks around data access, performance, or just dealing with messy data. And this can go all the way to a deeper dive into interpreting and explaining the results from maybe a family of predictive models. So at Alteryx, we see some of the most valuable training that we offer is actually around how to take an automated analytic process and turn it into a self-service analytic app. So this can put pretty complex business logic into the hands of hundreds of your users without requiring any coding or product knowledge. But from the flip side, the bottom-up approach, this is where we use internal expertise to self-organize in larger companies into user interest groups. But this could even start with just a single traditional data scientist and a single citizen data scientist. But it's a way to mentor individuals to step up to the next level. And it's a way to sort of execute these capabilities at a wider scale. To your point, I think this is where you also want to treat citizen data science as science. And this means getting into the good habits of things like peer review. And I'd recommend starting this process even before you invest in advanced analytics, as it's a really good discipline for everything that you produce in the world of analytics. Take a process, talk it through step by step, and you'll be surprised by how much constructive feedback you actually receive. When we get to using advanced analytics, that same process really becomes even more vital, as we want to use our data science team's knowledge and their expertise to augment the business domain expertise of that citizen data scientist. I mean, in this case, we're especially looking for blind spots in our model that could cause problems in operation. And having that process walkthrough with a data scientist should alleviate some of these concerns. So using this type of feedback helps deliver better citizen data science templates to structure future work as well.
Bill and Nick, are there groups or business teams or leaders that are natural partners for us in this effort?
Well, I'll take this firstly. So, Bill, you and I actually ran a finance analytics day at the stock exchange just a few months back, and we covered some absolutely essential use cases for departments that rely on, having accurate, actionable data, such as the finance department. And we had a great audience of analysts in the tax, FP&A, and audit space, and they had complex use cases, for example, like tax compliance, filing returns, fraud detection, even what-if analysis. And they often end up stuck in really difficult to maintain spreadsheet solutions. And over time, they build up significant technical debt just to maintain and upgrade these systems. So it's far better to give the same capabilities that everybody loves from spreadsheets, but in a more accessible way through a visual, repeatable workflow paradigm that also offers analytic process automation, version control, and governance end to end. What about you, Bill?
Yeah, honestly, I think that really the natural partners are any business leader in most any business unit. It could be anybody from the owner of all of your call support centers. It could be someone who's overseeing a manufacturing plant. I mean, basically, if there's data and analysis being consumed, that's someone who you could potentially partner with. Now, in reality, I think, obviously, when you start to talk about a manufacturing plant, there's probably not going to be too many people working in a manufacturing plant who are going to be eligible to have, access to a lot of what we've talked about. But when you get into a typically highly educated and inherently data focused group like a finance team, a marketing team, et cetera, I think that's where this type of approach really starts to make a lot of sense.
That's great. Oftentimes we do hear about those as being kind of key areas of focus for customers. So it's good to know that there are certain places where you can gain a lot of support. Let's talk a little bit about how you get started.
Yeah, I'll start with a couple thoughts here again as well. I think obviously the first one, which is a bit cliched, but is true here as well, is getting that executive buy-in to pursue this. The reality is, because of all these resistance points we've talked about, and as well as just the cost. When you think of what we've talked through, you're going to be investing in tools, in data, in training, in governance, right? This is going to have a pretty big price tag. You need somebody to be pushing this, and it not just necessarily a supporter, but a hardcore supporter to mandator, someone who's saying this will happen or it's not going to happen. I think the second point, if you're going to get started, you want to socialize both the benefits and the risks to set those right expectations. You don't want to go out and just talk about how wonderful it'll be and everyone will be able to do whatever they want, because that's going to cause problem when the reality hits. I think you want to be very upfront that we're going to have some mistakes and we're going to realize we gave somebody a little too much permission. That's part of the course. I think you want to make sure people understand that just because someone created an analytic process doesn't mean you want to go right out and use it. Someone's going to get burnt by not doing the diligence on the proofing and oversight. So it's just a lot of being honest with everybody. I think the most important part is to start documenting up front, even as you begin to plan. Who can actually do what, right? What is the line of who we're going to, give basic access to some pretty sophisticated access? What guardrails are we going to put in place? And I think guardrails can be both technological in terms of limiting access to data or certain types of functionality within a tool set. It can also be guardrails in terms of process, such as, a mentor has to review anything before that process can actually be, deployed to anyone, and start to think about how all the governance around that is going to work. And you want to start that right up front, because you don't want to be in a reactive mode trying to come up with your answers on the fly when things are out there. I think to start to get the early wins, as always, you want to find there's the people in both the data science and business communities that are most excited about this, and maybe pair them up for your initial test, your initial small scale effort to show how it'll all work. Like with everything else, I'd be a big proponent of test this out on a small subset of eager and capable people, so you can get some of the kinks out and realize things that you missed before you put it out to a whole lot of people and have a mess on your hands. These people who are really excited to do it as well will be much more forgiving and understanding of those things that you have to learn the hard way, and will be happy to help you get through that before it goes broader versus, some people are going to expect it to work from the get-go. And I think the last, most important point, which ties a little bit back to setting the right expectations, is acknowledge that this is a long and difficult effort, that there are going to be bumps in the road, that it will cost a lot of money, that there will be things that will be realized, oh, we thought that was a good idea, maybe it wasn't such a great idea after all for our business today. And so making sure that you're acknowledging that and that people understand that, because again, if the only way you can sell an effort like this is by focusing on all the positives, in my opinion, you've absolutely doomed yourself to failure. And I think a lot of times folks find it a bit refreshing if you're upfront at some of the challenges, because A, they appreciate it, but B, it shows. And I have more confidence when you tell me everything that might go wrong and how you're planning to mitigate it. I personally am more confident in the plan I've heard than if all I've heard is about how well it's going to go. Because then I wonder, are they believing their own story at this point, or are they just trying to give me the positive spin? So I'll say yes.
And Bill, I think it was probably one of Stephen Covey's original, 7 habits of highly effective people, where it's to start with the end in mind. I think that we often see analytics getting deployed successfully where there's a plan for the end in mind already set up at the start of that project. My personal approach here is really simply a value chain. So let's take those executives or the business decision makers. It's their job to understand the drivers that they're looking to alter via analytics. I'll give you an example. Let's say organizational growth, you know, a well-defined, clear objective. We take one level down, we start to look at outcomes. So the outcomes of organizational growth might be improving employee retention, how those outcomes are the result of basically taking analytics-based action from a series of questions. So are employees leaving at an increasing rate? Gives us an answer with which we can take action. And of course, we answer the questions by compiling consistent, transparent metrics from underlying data sources. So this chain that we build can of course be read top to bottom, or indeed bottom to top, where we go from data to questions to outcomes that then fundamentally affect our business drivers. So this kind of thinking, this framework, helps position the value of any analytic work in that wider context of making transformative change.
This is very great. This is great, guys. It's a kind of core to our value in business today. I mean, we've talked about sort of what does it mean to democratize that data for the organization, for users. You know, who those stakeholders are that really, you know, benefit and how they can benefit individually. You guys have given us a sense of, you know, the data scientist, citizen data scientist role and how it fits in and you know, where that fits versus a data scientist and how they can really help to drive change. And then what the risks are involved and, you know, how we're thinking about the due diligence and due process, you know, and due care around this, you know, what do we need to you know, consider when we're facing changes in this kind of approach to our business and mitigating those risks, you know, and addressing the, you know, the needs up front, you know, and pulling the right stakeholders in for the right governance of control, partnering with IT, making sure that you've got, you know, a good system of record and that you're using tools like automation and so forth to help reduce the costs and make sure that things don't go off the rails. You've also given us a good sense of, you know, how to get started and where to go, you know, when we're starting this, you know, who do we actually need to involve to help make that change across the organization. And, you know, starting small but accurately, it seems to be the course for many customers. At this time, I'd like to open it up to some questions. We've got some really great questions out there, and then have you guys, you know, give a crack at, you know, explaining sort of those details. We have one that really up front, you know, here is it fair to say that democratizing, you know, business intelligence tools like reporting, dashboarding, visualizations is fairly straightforward, but that democratizing or over automating analytics and machine learning can be, you know, can be dangerous, making reference of a citizen data scientist having to go to a data scientist or data pilot.
Well, Liam, I'll grab that one first of all. I've got a phrase: virality is not vitality. So, you know, we work with many customers who've seemingly had great success in introducing self-service visualization tools, maybe to repair their fragmented analytic processes. What often happens is that the rapid proliferation of a technology like this leads to a cottage industry of producers who've maybe never learned the discipline of data awareness to check for existing best practice, or even just to reuse what else is available across the organization. So what's really happening is the same battling spreadsheets now occurs in this new level of software. So again, it comes down to managing risk, and a great way to start managing this risk, you want to catalog these dashboards, these underlying data sources, and get a quick view from across the organization, look for duplication, focus the business's attention on maybe the most reputable of those assets. And actually, the same thing happens with self-service data science and the citizen data scientist. You know, what starts off as a simple process can very quickly evolve into a spaghetti-like mess of data wiring. And here, citizen data scientists can actually learn a lot from our friends in IT. So techniques that modularize data workflows into reusable blocks means that those enhancements, those fixes can now be applied much more quickly. And secondly, I think virality in general can quickly lead to disengagement if you don't plan for the huge untapped demand that exists in most organizations. So planning for scale means planning to avoid disappointment. So these citizen data science solutions are going to quickly gain traction. So you need to put a platform in place that can grow and then service your analytic throughput, for want of a better word, when you scale from that single user per department to teams and then ultimately across entire geographies. Bill, what do you think?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So I would say it's a very common question, but I'd argue that it might seem today that democratizing BI is fairly straightforward, but it wasn't always that way, right? I go back to the days when there was no such thing as a BI tool. It was SQL written by hand that we would then manually, grab output and maybe put it into Excel for someone to look at. And so there were virtually no ability to put guardrails. If you were going to do any kind of reporting, you had to handwrite SQL, character by character. But as BI tools evolved, we started to be able to have standardized views of data with join paths pre-identified within those tools, with certain metrics predefined. So it started to be possible for someone without a whole lot of skill to actually be kept safe in generating some reports. And I think most of us are now comfortable with that, much like the person who submitted the question. That wasn't true, back in the day when that first started. And I think we're at a very similar point here with the democratization of data science. Even 10 short years ago, for the most part, you needed somebody hand coding the sophisticated programming languages to do any type of sophisticated modeling or analysis. Now you have predefined widgets that you can choose a couple of standard options that can be predetermined. And it's very much, I think, in the same vein. And to give an analogy in our home life, in the old days, if you wanted to cook a cake, that was a pretty big deal. You had to know what you're doing. You had to make everything from scratch, and then you're cooking it over a wood fire or in a coal or wood-based oven, in a house where you could barely control the temperature. Today, I can go out, buy a cake mix that has everything pre-measured there. It basically says pour these couple things in a bowl together, and I can make a cake that's pretty darn good. You don't have a clue about cooking. Now, that doesn't mean I could begin to go out and make a scratch cake, but with those kits, I'm able to do it safely and reasonably, not as well as someone who can make a cake from scratch, but enough to get by when we just need a basic cake and we don't need a fancy cake. And I think that's the analogy of the kind of goal we're going for here, in my opinion.
That's a great analogy. I just made a cake, so. Going a little further into that, there's a question here around, what's the difference between, democratization and, data governance itself?
Well, data governance is really one aspect of democratizing data science, as we've kind of covered the topic a little bit. So data governance is one of the guardrails we put in place to make sure that you have the right amount of freedom. We're giving you the right data to be able to answer questions in certain scenarios, but also steering you towards the best, the most trusted assets on which you can build dependable data science models. So governance is very much part of the process, but it doesn't have to just be a stick. It can very much be a carrot as well. It's designed to make the organization flow as smoothly, as legally, as compliantly as possible in that process.
Good.
Yeah, and I agree as well. I think the big difference is that when we talk about democratizing data science, it's about organizing your governance in a different way to enable a different set of capabilities. So it's a little bit like, you might remodel your house, you might take out a few walls, you might rearrange how the kitchen's laid out. At the end, you still have a house, you still got a kitchen. It's just set up to make it a little more useful and a little more modern. And I think that's what we're talking about here is the democratization of data science is really about updating and expanding some of your current governance policies, which were probably very appropriate at one point in time, and making sure that, much like, you go look at a house, you go, boy, it's obvious this old retired couple lived here for 30 years because their kitchen still has, Formica and a green refrigerator. We don't want to get in that same trap when it comes to how we're doing data and analytics. And as I mentioned already, with the demand for analytics going up, if you don't try and come up with some different ways to meet that demand by enabling things from a different angle with different types of governance, then you're simply going to not be able to meet that demand. And that's going to cause you probably, as much pain business-wise or and likely even more than the pain you might have to go through to make all of this work.
I got you. So it's coming back to something you said earlier around, also making sure that all the different ways that folks are trying to do things. There's some common standards and a methodology approach. That you're not having too many ways, too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, cooking different ways incorrectly. Here's a very good question. Even though we as data stewards can see the big benefit of adopting such data analytics tools, there often tends to be members of leadership that are hesitant to adopt due to cost or fear of data adoption, knowledge transfer, or contentment with the status quo. Do you have some advice based on your experiences on how to effectively communicate to such individuals that this can be, open their minds, this can actually help the business in new ways, and help them consider adopting these newer methodologies?
So Liam, at our customer conference in Europe in a couple of weeks' time, I'm actually presenting on exactly this topic, because it can be so hard for organizations to start opening up, making things more available and starting that democratization process. I would suggest that the first approach is to look at the way that analytics are delivered today. And maybe in some organizations, this is through a request to IT, and IT have to go and provision some data to you and then deliver it in a secure format. And you end up looking at a process that is completely fragmented, is full of analytic choke points all along the way. And you actually work out from start to processing, through to analysis, through to testing and delivery. An IT-driven process might take between 12 and 15 weeks to answer a single analytics or citizen data science style question. That's going to involve a number of different resources, all of which have a cost associated to the business. So you can actually explicitly start to measure it in terms of time and money. Flip over to self-service, where the citizen data scientist will often do most of these steps themselves, but may actually reinvent the wheel at some points where they don't realize these assets exist. And again, we can measure the cost and we can measure the velocity. And we might take a 15-week process down to maybe 3 or 4 weeks when we do it through self-serve citizen data science. To get it even further, to really sharpen that saw, we might want to use a data catalog. We might want to see what assets already exist and simply bring them into our citizen data science environment. And we see examples where customers have taken this entire end-to-end process down to hours or days. So obviously the cost is incredibly small. The time to turn it around is incredibly small. There is real dollar value by expressing it in these terms.
Yeah, and I think when I hear the common objections, right? People are afraid of the change, et cetera. One thing I've always been a big fan of, and I've made liberal use of in the past, is I like sort of the skunk work approach of finding a way to prove the general concept before you push for the big boom. So if people are really resistant to this, I'll go to an extreme example. Have one of these citizen data scientist types get officially assigned to the data science team, bring them over. And then as they're part of the data science team, then everyone might be comfortable with them getting certain permissions. But you on the team know, yeah, but we're not actually going to give them all the permissions they could get, because we're trying to define what a citizen data scientist setup would look like. And you can get that person productive and potentially then show everyone, look, you may not have realized what we were doing, but what we've just done is enabled this person to do things that they never would have been able to do from the business, but that if we gave them the permission, we could still work with them to help them do it appropriately. And what we'd like to ask is, why don't we expand this to 5 more people this year? And then if that's successful, we can go, division-wide, company-wide, et cetera, depending on, the size of your organization. But I think that's really, in my mind, always a good way to go about getting past that resistance is just try and get enough to prove it, much like, websites will do a lot of A/B tests and just try and figure out, what's going to work before they put it out there. When people see results, they tend to have their mind change much more than when they hear about the theoretical results. And so that's a way to get that support.
Good. Gentlemen, there's a question here that is around data quality. I think it harkens back to a couple of points you made earlier around, making sure you've got, asking the right questions within the organization. But it's fundamentally, what's the importance of data quality in all of this new analytics era? And I think to some extent, there's also that concern around data sources and making sure that, there's some due diligence around capturing the right data from the right sources and so forth.
Yeah, for me, data quality is just one of the challenges that a citizen data scientist is going to face in their role. Unfortunately, it never ends. It's never mission accomplished and we get to fly a big flag, but it does get tackled as part of each analytic project, really as part of a wider program of quality. And from my side, remember, poor data quality introduces waste into an analytics pipeline. So as a citizen data scientist, you're constantly looking for the removal of waste. You're trying to iterate, trying to make everything leaner and meaner as a way to reduce that data quality issue to get you to the best result.
Yeah, and I'd say because these are citizen data scientists, the capabilities we will be giving them should be largely to hit curated data sets. In other words, these people aren't necessarily going into the raw underlying data like a data scientist or one of the the data owners on the IT side would in its more raw form. We should be hopefully giving them already mostly clean data. At the same time, we know that other problems will be found. So they'll be on the lookout, like Nick said, for things. But this gets back to keeping someone within their capability. You don't want to be throwing raw source system data that hasn't been used by the organization before at a citizen data scientist. I think that's a bit extreme. But to say, we've got some supply chain data that we've been using for various reports and other analytics for many years. It's pretty much mostly clean, and we're going to let you go at it and try and do some new things with it. That should be a relatively safe endeavor when it comes to that data quality. But I think the data quality as a whole would still rest below the level of these people at the folks that are really responsible for making that data enterprise ready in the first place.
Bill, I'll just add one point to that. So unfortunately, we do see citizen data scientists being asked to work with, almost live and messy data. It's kind of come in tandem with the arrival of the data lake. So where lots of telemetry or business data almost just gets thrown into object stores up in the cloud. And these analysts are being asked to work and interpret that data. So you're absolutely right. It's great if we have clean and structured data, but sometimes we don't. So you've got to look for capabilities that allow you to work with those, to recognize there's missing data, to immediately spot that on the screen as part of your analytic flow. But also, if you are building models on this data, you're going to need the ability to impute with maybe a median or a mean value, or maybe to drop a column entirely. And you're going to want assisted guidance at each step in that process. So you're going to need friendly nudges to make sure that the citizen data scientist knows that there's an issue here and the guardrail is steering you towards that right solution. Kind of all the things that the data scientist takes for granted, we need to make sure are in the hands of the citizen data scientist, but in a friendly and approachable way.
So they must work closely together in order to make sure that there's some view into this. There's some sensitivity to the type of data that's coming in, so that it's not just blindly taken. One other question that's come up, and this is around getting started the right way. But what type of proof of concepts would you recommend? What are the best ways to define one when you're trying to make sure that you're building awareness within the organization and providing real value?
Well, I think there are probably two types of POC, and a quick word of warning about POCs: always make sure they are time boxed and that they have a specific objective. Otherwise they can just roll on and they can actually become live systems if you're not careful. So do make sure you're running an experiment. Treat it as an experiment and get it working. The two types of POC that we traditionally see, there's an innovation POC, maybe where you're taking an existing business process and you're looking to replace one part of it. So we can rip out something that you currently do across multiple spreadsheets, and lots of customer examples in the Alteryx world on this, where Excel just doesn't cut it when we get to the data volumes or the sophistication of analysis, and then we replace it with a different component, so we can now do something smarter, faster, in a different color, whatever it might be. The flip side is that disruptive POC, where we're actually going in and potentially flipping the table. We're potentially coming up with a whole new business model or a revenue stream based on our use of data and based on our use of data science principles. So those are the ones that can actually pay the bills for entire departments if you get this right. But of course, they come with much more risk and uncertainty, and you need to manage which side you're really going for in that POC.
And I'll just thought, I think that there's no standard answer as to what that POC would be. I think what you have to do is it's organizational specific. Look at where are some of the types of questions that you're getting asked today where you're having more demand than you can handle, but they're not overly sophisticated questions either. And there happens to be some people that appear to be relatively sophisticated in the group where that's occurring. That would be a great place to go and do that POC. But again, in one organization, that might be marketing, another it might be operations, another it might be finance, and it could be, you know, different specific issues within those. But I think it's looking for that mix of high demand with a person or more of skill in place already.
Great. Thank you both, Nick and Bill. We are at the top of the hour. I'd like to thank all the participants and attendees as well, and remind you that we will be sending out the recording and additional resources along with that. Lindsay, I'd like to pass it over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Liam. And thank you, Nick and Bill. Great job today. Thank you, everyone who joined us. This was a great conversation and a great webinar. Just to kind of copy what Liam said, a recording of this will come out tomorrow, along with any additional resources that we've mentioned will also be in that email. And the presentation will be available on the II website. Go ahead and stay tuned to II social media. We've got some more upcoming webinars in the coming months that I think you're going to enjoy. And next week, we're going to be at our Fall Analytics Symposium, which is our practitioner-only, community-only non-vendor event. So stay tuned to our social media to see some of our all-star keynoters and what they're talking about and trends on analytics. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.